This is not a story of a roaring fire in a blizzard, but of a single candle held steady against a draught. It is the story of a love that was not found in a grand rescue, but built, board by board, in the quiet rooms of a lonely house. A love that learned to breathe in the silence and speak in the space between two hands, almost touching. Elias Thorne moved through his life with the economy of a man who had nothing left to waste. Not words, not motion, not hope. The sun rose, and he rose with it, the chill of the high plains air a familiar ghost against his skin. His ranch, nestled in a shallow valley, was a testament to order. Fences stood straight, their wires humming in the wind. The barn was swept clean, tools hanging in their precise outlines on the wall. In the house, the table was set for one, the chair opposite his own pushed neatly against the oak, its surface reflecting the lamplight with a lonely sheen. He made his bed each morning, pulling the quilt taut, smoothing away the phantom impression of a second person, a memory worn thin as the fabric itself. His wife, Sarah, had been gone 4 years, and the silence she'd left behind had become his most constant companion. It was a silence that echoed in the clink of his fork against the plate, in the creak of the floorboards under his solitary weight, in the vast, empty space on the other side of the mattress. He was a capable man, his hands competent whether they were calming a nervous horse or stitching a tear in his own worn leather gloves. He spoke little, but he listened to the language of the land, the whisper of dry grass, the cry of a hawk, the distant rumble of an approaching rain. He was a protector with nothing left to protect, a sentry at an empty post. His moral code was etched into him like brands on his cattle. Work hard, be honest, harm none. But beneath the stoicism, buried deep under the layers of grief and routine, was a yearning so quiet he himself barely acknowledged it, a desire not for noise, but for a second heartbeat in the oppressive hush of his home. The arrangement felt practical, and therefore safe. Reverend Miller had proposed it with a gentle, worried look in his eyes, his gaze flickering from Elias's solitary figure to the young woman, sitting ramrod straight on the church pew. Her name was Elara Vance, and she had arrived in the small town of Providence with a single carpet bag and a pride that sat on her like a well-worn shawl. She needed work, and more than that, she needed sanctuary. Elias needed a housekeeper. His attempts at domesticity were functional but joyless, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, a silent rebuke to his neglect. He had his ranch to run, and the house, once a shared warmth, had become just another chore. The Reverend framed it as a perfect solution, an act of Christian charity on both their parts. Elias saw it for what it was, a transaction. He would provide a roof and safety. She would provide the labor that would keep the lonely edges of his life from fraying completely. He agreed with a single clipped nod. The terms were laid out in his sparse, direct way that evening, the two of them standing in the main room of the ranch house, a respectful distance between them. "You'll have the small room at the back," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt foreign in the silent space. "It has its own door to the outside. What is mine is not yours, but you will not want for food or warmth. Your work is in this house. The ranch is my domain. You are safe here." He did not smile. He did not offer platitudes. He offered a contract, clear and solid as the wooden beams above their heads. Elara, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, met his gaze. There was a resilience in her eyes, a perceptiveness that missed nothing. She was a survivor. He could see that in the proud set of her jaw, in the way she held her own space. "And my room is my own?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question of property, but of autonomy. He understood. "No one will enter it without your leave, not even me." She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I accept your terms, Mr. Thorne." The house, for the first time in 4 years, held 2 heartbeats, each one cautiously mapping the presence of the other in the unfamiliar quiet. A new rhythm began, hesitant and unwritten. In the beginning, they were two separate orbits in a shared universe, their paths crossing only at the prescribed intersections of the day. She rose before him, and the scent of coffee and baking bread would greet him when he came in from the morning chores, a ghost of a life he had long since buried. He would eat at the table while she worked in the kitchen, the space between them filled with the sounds of her movements, the soft scrape of a knife on a cutting board, the gentle clink of pottery. He found she was as economical in her motions as he was, her work done with a quiet efficiency that left the house gleaming but not sterile. She brought a subtle warmth back into the cold rooms, not with clutter, but with care. A jar of wildflowers appeared on the windowsill. A braided rug softened the floor by the hearth. He never commented, but he noticed. He noticed everything. He learned the soft fall of her footsteps, the way she hummed under her breath when she needed dough, a sound so low it was more a vibration in the air than a melody. The first true shift came with a shirt. He had ripped the sleeve on a nail, a long, jagged tear. He'd left it on a chair, intending to patch it crudely himself later. When he returned that evening, it was folded neatly on his bed, the sleeve repaired with a line of stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was a simple domestic act, but it felt like a conversation, the first one that wasn't about schedules or supplies. The next morning, he left a small bowl of wild raspberries by the teapot he knew she used, the one with the chip on the rim. It was his reply. Trust was being built not with words, but with thread and berries. He began to look for her, his eyes scanning the house not for threats, but for her presence. He would find her reading by the fire, the light catching the earnest concentration on her face as she traced the words in a book she had brought. He had a small collection of his wife's books, and one evening he silently placed one on the small table beside her chair. He didn't speak, just met her surprised gaze with a slight nod before retreating to his own side of the hearth. It was an offering, a key to a part of the life that had existed here before. He was the protector, but he was slowly learning that protection wasn't just about a locked door. It was about creating a space where someone could feel safe enough to be still. From her point of view, the house was a haven of predictability. Elias Thorne was a man of his word. He was quiet, but his silence was not menacing. It was a settled, thoughtful thing. He moved around her with a careful awareness of her space, never crowding, never assuming. She had come from a world where men's hands were quick to grab, their voices loud with demands. Elias's hands were large and calloused, but they were gentle. She watched him soothe a spooked horse, his touch firm and steady, his voice a low murmur, and she saw the protector he truly was. Her fear, a constant companion on her journey, began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started to see the loneliness in him, the deep well of grief he carried so stoically. Her small acts of domestic care were her way of speaking to that grief, of acknowledging the man beneath the hardened exterior. She was a survivor, and she recognized the scars of survival in him, too. The language of consent was unspoken at first, written in feet of distance and averted gazes. Then it began to be spoken in the quietest of invitations. He needed to get to the wood box behind where she was sitting, and instead of just reaching around her, he stopped. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "May I pass?" The courtesy was so unexpected it startled her. She moved immediately, a faint flush on her cheeks. "Of course." It was a small moment, but it laid another stone in the foundation of her trust. She began to test the boundaries of their arrangement in tiny, careful ways. One afternoon, while he was cleaning a rifle on the porch, she noticed a smudge of grease on his cheek. In her old life, to touch a man without invitation was to risk a blow or a leering remark. Here, she hesitated for a long moment, her heart a quiet drum against her ribs. Then she took a breath, stepped forward, and said his name. "Elias." He looked up, his hands stilling on the rifle. "You have a smudge." She didn't move. Her hand lifted slightly, an unspoken question. He stared at her for a beat, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he gave a minuscule nod. She reached out, her fingers just brushing his skin as she wiped the grease away with her thumb. The touch was electric in its brevity, a spark in the vast quiet of their lives. His skin was warm and rough. She pulled her hand back as if from a flame. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. It was the first time she had initiated contact, and he had honored it, had waited for her lead. Longing began to seed itself in the fertile ground of that respect. It was in the way her gaze lingered on the strong column of his neck when he bent over his work, the way his eyes would find hers across the room, a silent acknowledgment that held more weight than 1,000 words. He began to offer her the fuller cup of coffee, the warmer seat by the fire, small, repeatable gestures of a care he could not yet name. One evening he was returning from the barn, a sharp-edged axe in his hand. He met her at the door. He stopped, turned the tool around, and offered it to her hilt first, a gesture of profound trust and respect, an acknowledgment that he would never use his strength against her. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his, and the quiet vow was sealed between them. He would protect her. She would trust him. And in that shared space of safety and respect, something tender and terrifying began to grow. A late summer storm announced itself, with a low rumble in the west, the air growing thick and heavy with unspoken promises. It was not a storm of peril, but of atmosphere, the kind that drove people indoors and turned houses into intimate sanctuaries. The rain began as a soft patter on the roof, then deepened into a steady, percussive drumming. It was this drumming that revealed the small leak in the corner of Elara's room. A steady drip, at first a minor annoyance, soon became a persistent trickle, pooling on the floorboards. She caught the water in a basin, but it was clear the room would be inhospitable for the night. When she told Elias, he looked at the ceiling, then at her, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "The spare bed is in the barn," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the storm outside. "It will be damp." He did not immediately offer a solution, simply stated the facts. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythm of the rain and the drip of water into the tin basin. He was giving her the space to voice her own needs, to be a partner in the decision. "The floor is hard," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the growing puddle. He nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers. "My bed is warm," he stated, another simple fact. He paused, the weight of his next words filling the small room. "You would be safe there. Only if you want." The offer hung in the air, a testament to the trust they had so carefully built. It was an invitation, not a demand. He immediately offered the concession that would preserve her dignity completely. "I can sleep on the floor, by the fire." He would give up his own comfort, his own Ned, to ensure she felt no pressure, no obligation. It was in that moment that she understood the depth of his honor. She, the survivor who had always had to fight for her own agency, was being given it freely, unconditionally. And so she made her own offer, a step across the boundary that separated them. "Propriety would have us share the roof, not the room," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But your word has been your bond, Mr. Thorne. I will take the bed." She met his gaze directly, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "But the floor is no place for the master of the house. You may sleep by the fire, in your own room." His name, spoken with that hint of warmth, was a new kind of intimacy. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Elias," he corrected her softly. The storm raged outside, but inside the small log house, a different kind of electricity crackled in the air. Later, as she lay in his bed, the scent of him on the pillow-clean linen, wood smoke, and dry earth, the sheer size of the space, felt both daunting and protective. He was a silent form on the floor near the hearth, a dark shape wrapped in a blanket, his breathing slow and even. He had placed his gun belt on the mantel, a clear sign that he was not on guard against her. The proximity was a heady, terrifying thing. It was not about desire, not yet, but about a profound mutual choice to share a space, to be vulnerable together. It was a vow made not with words, but with the simple, consensual act of sharing a room against the storm. The rain on the roof was a lullaby, and for the first time since she had fled her old life, Elara slept without fear. The outside world arrived in a polished buggy, drawn by a horse far too fine for the dusty roads of Providence. Mr. Alistair Sterling was a man stitched from a different cloth than the townsfolk. His suit was tailored, his words were smooth, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He was the predator from Elara's past, the reason she had run. He was not an outlaw or a ruffian. His weapon was entitlement. His currency was coercion. He believed he had a claim on her, a marriage contract arranged between their families that she had refused to honor. He found her, as he inevitably would have, through inquiries and the flash of money. He did not come to the ranch at first. He established himself in the town's only boarding house, letting his presence be known, letting the gossip begin to churn. The sight of Elara in town for supplies, her arm brushed by Elias as he helped her down from the wagon, was all it took. Sterling saw her not as a person, but as a misplaced possession. His presence was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their lives. He approached her in the general store, his manner proprietary, his voice low and confiding as if they were co-conspirators. "Elara, my dear, such a foolish game of hide and seek. It's time to come home." He ignored her stiff posture, the way she pulled her arm from his grasp. He was a foil to Elias in every way. Where Elias asked for consent, Sterling assumed it. Where Elias offered protection, Sterling offered ownership. His intrusion tested the fragile, unspoken bond between Elias and Elara. The town, which had mostly accepted their quiet arrangement, now buzzed with speculation. Sterling painted a picture of a concerned fiancé, searching for his lost bride-to-be, a woman perhaps not in her right mind, taken in by a reclusive rancher. The social pressure was a quiet, insidious thing. At the ranch, the tension was palpable. The easy, growing rhythm of their domesticity was disrupted. Elias watched her, his usual quietness now laced with a protective vigilance. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He waited for her to speak, giving her the agency she deserved. He just made his presence a little more constant, working on the porch instead of the barn, his steady, solid form a silent statement of support. The pressure cooker of Sterling's presence finally forced the words out. The confrontation in town had left Elara shaken, her composure cracked. That evening, the silence in the house was heavy, strained. She moved about the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared a meal neither of them wanted. Elias watched her from the hearth, his heart aching with a feeling he recognized as more than just protective instinct. It was a deep, resonant empathy. He broke the silence, his voice gentle. "He will not harm you here." It was a simple vow, a plain statement of fact as he saw it, but it was the opening she needed. She stopped, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. "He doesn't need to use his fists," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "His power is in his name, his money, in papers and promises that other men signed." And then, in the warm, safe glow of the lamplight, she told him. She spoke of the arranged marriage, of a family who saw her as a commodity, of Sterling's suffocating entitlement, his belief that her body and her future were his to command. She spoke of her escape, the fear that had been her constant companion, and the quiet dignity she was trying to build for herself. Elias listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer solutions. He simply sat, his presence a rock in the turbulent waters of her confession, his focused attention a sign of ultimate respect. He was absorbing her story, honoring the weight of her past. When she was finished, Her voice trailing off into a ragged sigh, he was silent for a long moment. He then rose, walked to the stove, and poured her a cup of tea, his large hand surprisingly steady. He set it on the table in front of her. Only then did he speak, his own confession offered in exchange for hers, a quiet trade of vulnerabilities. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice thick with memory. "She died of a fever. The doctor was too far away. I was here. I held her hand, but I couldn't protect her from that." He looked at his own hands as if they had failed him. "This house, it's been a quiet place for a long time. Too quiet." He didn't need to say more. In that shared moment of lamplit confession, the final emotional doors swung open. He understood the nature of her predator, and she understood the source of his deep-seated need to protect. His habit of scanning rooms for threats was not just about physical danger. It was about the insidious dangers you couldn't see, the ones that could steal the light from a person's eyes. And he saw that light in her, a resilient, courageous flame, and he would be damned if he let a man like Sterling extinguish it. The confrontation came, as it must, on the porch. It was their space, the threshold between the home they had built and the world that sought to tear it apart. Sterling arrived not with a gun, but with a lawyer from a bigger town, a man who held a sheaf of papers like a weapon. They presented Elias with a contract, a legal document signed by Elara's father, promising her hand and her inheritance to Alistair Sterling. It was a formal, legal claim designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Sterling's smile was triumphant. He did not address Elara directly, but spoke to Elias, man to man, as if she were a piece of property to be transferred. "Thorne, you've been a decent caretaker, I suppose. But her childish rebellion is over. Elara, pack your things." Elias did not look at the papers. He did not look at Sterling. He looked at Elara, who stood beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. He took a half-step back, a subtle shift in position that was monumental in its meaning. He was not standing in front of her to shield her. He was standing beside and slightly behind her, a silent, unshakable support. He was ceding the stage to her. This was her battle, her choice, and he would be her witness and her guard, but not her voice. Sterling's arrogance faltered for a moment at this unexpected dynamic. "Did you hear me, girl?" he demanded, his voice sharpening. The silence stretched, taut and humming. Then Elara took a breath. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her gaze clear and unwavering as she met Sterling's. "I am not a parcel to be traded, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying the unmistakable weight of conviction. "Those papers are meaningless. They were signed by men who do not own me." She paused, her eyes flickering to Elias, a quick affirming glance that was a conversation in itself. "I am not yours to claim." Seeing his legal maneuvering fail, Sterling's veneer of civility cracked. "You would choose this? This ... rustic silence? A life of servitude with this grim mute?" He gestured dismissively at Elias and the simple log house. Elara's response was her climax, her final, definitive act of agency. "This is not servitude. This is partnership, and this is not silence. It is peace." She took another step, closing the distance between herself and Elias, and she slipped her hand into his. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers instantly, a perfect fit. It was then that Elias spoke, his voice a low, final rumble that carried the weight of an oath. He looked directly at Sterling, his gaze flat and cold as river stone. "She is home." The simple declaration, combined with their linked hands, was more powerful than any weapon, more binding than any legal document. It was a public choice, a plain vow, partnership, home. Sterling stared at their joined hands, at the unshakable unity in their stance, and he knew he was defeated. No legal threat, no social pressure could break a bond forged in such quiet, deliberate care. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel, the lawyer trailing in his wake. The buggy rattled away, leaving only the dust and the profound, ringing silence of their victory. In the aftermath, the adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving them both trembling with a quiet, resonant exhaustion. They didn't speak. They simply turned from the porch and retreated into the sanctuary of the house, the closing of the door a final, definitive sound. The emotional toll of the encounter hung in the air, a fine dust that needed to be settled. Elias's gaze, which had been so fierce moments before, softened with a profound tenderness as he looked at her. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the paleness of her face. He led her to a chair by the hearth and gently pushed her down to sit. He knelt before her, his large frame seeming to fold in on itself to make her feel safe. He took her hands in his, chafing them gently. It was then he saw a tiny splinter of wood embedded in her palm, a consequence of gripping the rough-hewn porch rail during the confrontation. The sight of that small injury, a physical manifestation of her emotional trial, moved him deeply. Without a word, he went to his shaving kit and returned with a pair of tweezers and a clean cloth. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He bent his head, his focus absolute as he worked to gently, carefully remove the splinter. His touch was exquisitely tender, a stark contrast to the strength in his hands. He was a protector, and this was his aftercare, his way of tending to wounds both visible and invisible. Once the splinter was out, he wiped the small pinprick of blood away and pressed a soft kiss to her palm, a gesture of reverence and devotion that made her breath catch in her throat. Later, the domestic rhythm they had built became the vessel for their healing. She found him in the barn, washing his hands in a basin, the water stained with the grime of his work, and she imagined the residue of the day's conflict. She came to him with a clean towel. As he dried his hands, she took the soap in a cloth and began to gently wash the ink-like stains from his fingers, the small cuts and calluses that told the story of his labor and his protection. They met in the kitchen's lamplight, the world outside fading to black. He cut a piece of freshly baked bread and spread it with butter, lifting it to her lips. She accepted it, then did the same for him, feeding him a spoonful of the stew she had made. It was a silent, sacred communion, an act of mutual nourishment, of replenishing the strength they had given each other. In these quiet, tender moments, in the careful tending of a splintered finger and the shared warmth of a simple meal, they reaffirmed their bond, washing away the last traces of the outside world's ugliness and consecrating the peace they had chosen together. The days that followed the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace, a quiet rhythm no longer underscored by uncertainty. Their shared routines became less about function and more about a deepening intimacy. The question of her staying was no longer a question at all. It was a settled fact, as solid as the foundation of the house. But the explicit invitation was still a promise that needed to be spoken, a choice to be freely offered and freely accepted. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the colors of the sunset bleed across the sky, Elias turned to her. He held a small object in his palm. It was a bird, carved from a piece of scrap wood, its lines simple but full of life. He had been working on it for weeks in the quiet moments of the evening. "I'm not a man of pretty words, Elara," he said, his voice a low burr. "This house... it was just a place to sleep. You've made it a home again." He pressed the small carving into her hand. "I would be honored if you would choose to stay. Not as a housekeeper, as a partner." The word hung in the air between them, full of meaning. It was everything she had ever wanted, a choice, not an obligation. She closed her fingers around the wooden bird, its surface smooth and warm from his hand. "I have already chosen," she whispered. In return, a few days later, she presented him with his favorite work coat. He had thought it was beyond repair, the elbows worn through, a long tear in the lining. She had spent hours restoring it, her perfect stitches reinforcing the worn fabric, a piece of soft flannel patched over the inside. It was not just a repair. It was an act of devotion, a promise to care for him as he had cared for her. Their vows were not made before a preacher, but in these quiet, symbolic exchanges. They spoke of the future in plain, domestic terms that held the weight of poetry. "The garden will need expanding if we're to have enough for two through the winter," she said one afternoon. "We'll need to build a new shelf for the books," he replied, his eyes crinkling in a rare, unguarded smile. Each statement was a brick being laid for the future they were building together, a future predicated on shared work, shared space, and shared care. The loneliness had fully receded from the house, replaced by a quiet, steady hum of companionship. The ranch had always been known simply as the Thorne place, a name that tethered it to one man in his past. But it was no longer the place it had been. It was a shared space, a joint creation. It needed a new name, one that belonged to both of them. They spoke of it one evening, the conversation easy and natural. He suggested names that spoke of strength and endurance, like Stone Creek or Ridgeback. She offered names that spoke of peace and sanctuary, like Haven Hill or Quiet Meadow. They settled on one that felt like a perfect fusion of their two spirits, Stillwater Ranch. It spoke of the quiet peace she had found there, and the deep, steady strength he embodied. The next day, Elias took down the old, weathered sign that hung from the gatepost. He spent the afternoon carefully carving the new name into a fresh plank of pine. Elara stood with him, sanding the rough edges smooth, her hand occasionally brushing his. When it was done, they hung it together. Standing back, they looked at the new sign, a simple public declaration of their new life. It was no longer just his place. It was their home. Their found family was small, just the two of them, but it was complete. The community, which had been so quick to gossip, now saw the truth of their arrangement. They saw it in the way Elias looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look of profound, gentle devotion. They saw it in the confident peace she now wore, her resilience no longer a guarded shield, but a quiet, steady flame. Reverend Miller paid them a visit, his eyes kind as he took in the sight of them working together in the garden, their movements synchronous and easy. He saw the wildflowers in the window, the two chairs on the porch set close together. He didn't speak of marriage or propriety. He spoke of blessings. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his gaze warm as it rested on them both. "This is a good place. You've brought life back to it, Elara." And in his quiet affirmation, they felt the acceptance of the community, not as a judgment they had to pass, but as a simple acknowledgment of the truth, that two lonely souls had found a home in each other on their own terms, in their own time. The end of summer settled over Stillwater Ranch, the heat of the day giving way to cool, comfortable evenings. The future was no longer an uncertain horizon, but a tangible thing, something they could feel in the steady rhythm of their shared days. Their love story was not written in grand declarations, but in the small, repeated gestures that had become their language. It was in the way he always brought her the first ripe apple from the tree, and the way she always saved him the last piece of pie. It was a love built on a foundation of respect so deep it was simply the air they breathed. The final promise was not spoken at an altar, but on their own porch, the new sign gleaming in the moonlight. He had just finished his final check of the barn, and she was waiting for him, a mended scarf in her hands. It was the one he'd worn thin over the years, a relic from his past life. She had rewoven the frayed edges, her stitches breathing new life into the old wool. She wrapped it around his neck, her hands lingering for a moment on his chest. He reached into his pocket and brought out the small, carved bird, now sanded so smooth it felt like a living thing. He pressed it back into her palm. "So you always remember you have a place to land," he said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet night. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I'm not flying anywhere," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, the scent of wood smoke and pine filling her senses. It was the culmination of every careful touch, every shared silence, every consensual step they had taken toward each other. He leaned down, his lips brushing her temple. "I will keep you warm," he vowed, the words a familiar promise, now filled with a lifetime of meaning. She tilted her head back, her eyes meeting his in the soft glow from the window. "And you," she promised in return, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty, "are safe here." The house behind them was no longer silent. It was filled with the quiet, steady hum of a love that had been patiently, carefully built, a single candle held steady, burning brightly against the dark.